Good evening. It is a great pleasure to be back in a university, and not any university, but to be back at a new school. Because a new school is one of the very few bastions of subversive thinking in economics. And these days, unless you're subversive in the way you think about economics, you're not thinking about economics, you're thinking about a wonderful, aesthetically pleasing model whose utility comes from having absolutely nothing to do with really existing capitalism. So congratulations to the good people of New School for maintaining a commitment to remaining in connection with really existing capitalism and having something useful to say about this. This, I've been told, is a lecture in honor of Robert Heilbronner. Anwar before said a few words about Robert and about his wonderful work, and especially the worldly philosophers, which I will have to second the point that it remains a brilliant introduction to economic thinking. Because what Robert brought to us was this magnificent combination of economic history and history of economic thought. Now, in any other university in this state, on this continent, probably on this planet, this kind of thinking is considered to be woolly and redolent of an inability to be technical, to be scientific about economics. The view everywhere else except for the New School and another 2 or 3 places around the world is that take physics. Why would a good physicist waste time writing and researching and teaching about the history of physics? The history of physics is full of error. Just read Aristotle's physics. It's just pathetically inaccurate. It's a very interesting story of a major fallacy. Yeah? But if you're a physicist, why would you want to engage? It's something you do when you are about 93, just before you kick the bucket. You may read Aristotle and write about your reminiscences of yourself as a young physicist in the relation to the error of Aristotle. Of course, the difference is that economics is not a science. At least it is not a natural science. And the profound difference, I'm not going to give a lecture on this, but unlike in physics, where the latest textbook is more or less guaranteed to be more knowledgeable about nature than a textbook of 20, 30, 300, 3,000 years ago, in economics, we tend to forget to lose truths that previous generations understood better. In a sense, if you go back 30 years, the consensus on what was the essence of capitalism was much closer to today's capitalism than the latest textbook taught at Columbia, at New York University, at the University of Sussex, wherever. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, but it's not a phenomenon that we should be looking at today. I just had to mention it because Heilbronner was committed to the idea that the only way of approaching economics was through this combination of the history of economic thought, of economic history, and analytics, but all together. So I'm very pleased to be delivering a talk in his honor, and especially in this magnificent place. Now, what I wanted to talk about today was the present and the future of capitalism and democracy. The problem in today's world is that one needs, before one says anything sensible about capitalism and democracy, we need to return to basics, don't we? What do we mean by capitalism? What do we mean by democracy? I talk to financiers all the time. I talk to journalists all the time. If you ask them what capitalism is, they are lost. They assume that they know, but if you push them, they will end up regurgitating the story about markets, a system of markets, as if capitalism is all about markets. And if you ask them about democracy, then they're completely lost, utterly lost. So let's just spend a few moments contemplating those two concepts. And I'll begin with democracy. Even though I'm an economist, my recent experiences lead me towards grappling with democracy before I go into the concept of capitalism. And let me just share part of this recent experience in the first meeting of Europe's finance ministers, where I was representing Greece as its finance minister. I was a rookie. It was my first meeting, and as a rookie, I was afforded the floor to begin participating, presenting to the other finance ministers my agenda, the agenda of our government, what it is that we came to Brussels with in terms of proposals and predisposition. And I try to be, given my reputation as the finance minister of the radical left-wing government of Greece, of a country whose state was bankrupt and in debt to the tune of $400 billion, I try to be moderate. So I began by explaining that I understand that they were quite peeved that I was there, that I was a living and breathing inconvenience, that they would much rather the other lot had won the election. And I tried to show a degree of understanding towards that. And I said to them, the only reason why I'm here is because of the Great Depression of Greece. Greece went bankrupt in 2010, and you lot, I didn't say you lot, but that's what I meant, together with the Greek ruling elites, decided to cover that bankruptcy up by extending to the Greek state the largest loan in human history under conditions that ensured, with mathematical precision, the shrinkage of our GDP by 28%. 28%, Steinbeck, the Grapes of Wrath, that kind of magnitude and dimension. Yeah? And the people of Greece decided to send somebody like me to say to you, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to extend and pretend. We're not going to take another loan to pretend that we are repaying our debts under conditions that will continue to shrink our income and to sink our country deeper and deeper into depression. Indeed, come to think of it, it took a Great Depression to bring to power a radical left-wing Minister of Finance who went to the Eurogroup to present them something that would normally come out of the mouth of a Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer. That if the debt is unsustainable, it makes no sense to pretend that it is sustainable, that you need to restructure it, and you need to have a rethink about the loan agreement. This is what bankruptcy lawyers do in downtown here every day. They restructure corporate loans, municipality loans, all sorts of loans that need to be restructured so that the creditors can get something back. Amartya Sen, you may have heard of him, when we met some time ago, he said, "You had a very difficult time, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, I know, Amartya." He said, "You must have been the only person to have been negotiating that with creditors that did not want their money back." Because creditors want to restructure your debt. Now, what did I experience? And why is this my introduction to the concept of democracy? Okay, first meeting, I'm trying to be moderate. So I say, dear colleagues, I'm here to participate with you in a project, a joint project of rebooting the Greek economy, to bring about the recovery which is necessary to produce the incomes from which you will get your money back. I understand that there is an existing program that the previous governments have signed up to. And because of the principle that the state has a certain degree of continuity. It's not that we elect a new government and we start from year zero. We're not Pol Pot. But there is also another principle, the principle of democracy. We were elected on a mandate to challenge this program. So what happens in a democratic European Union when you have two principles, continuity and democracy, clashing? We sit down and we establish common ground. We compromise. And I thought that that would be the most moderate way with which to start a beautiful friendship with my new colleagues. I didn't get a chance to put the period, the full stop to my sentence. Wolfgang Schäuble puts his hands up. Actually, you don't put, what you do is you take your name tag and you stand it on its head. That's what you do in the Eurogroup. Bang! One sentence. Elections cannot be allowed to change the economic policies applied to Greece. Then I took my name tag and stood it on its head. Having regained the floor, I said, this is a great gift to the Chinese Communist Party because they believe exactly the same thing. You see, this is, if you want, my introduction to the ways in which the neoliberal agenda that has emerged out of the second post-war phase of global capitalism has undermined the narrative of the ruling elites regarding democracy. Now they are reaching a point of having no scruples about declaring democracy null and void. No longer do they feel even the need to appropriate the mantra of democracy for propaganda purposes. Now they are, effectively, it's the greatest vindication of Lee Kuan Yew, of Deng Xiaoping. The idea that efficiency has replaced the need to consult voters. This is very interesting. And I believe that we will understand a lot about the future of capitalism by delving a little bit more into it. But now let's go a long way back into the past. Democracy, like all bad things, began in Athens. Let me remind you that the Cold War began in Athens. It didn't begin in Berlin. The Cold War began December 1944 in the streets of Athens, 6 months before we had any of the antagonisms between the Soviet Union and the Allies in Berlin. The Euro crisis began in Athens. And of course, democracy began in Athens. There's something about the place. I don't know what it is. Now, it is usually, and for good reason, said that democracy in ancient Athens was so severely circumscribed by racism and by sexism, by the exclusion of the metics. The metics were the migrants, the foreigners, of course, the slaves, and women. But it would be a mistake, and I think Ellen Wood has made a very good case for this. It would be a mistake to dismiss ancient Athenian democracy on the basis of whom it excluded. It is much more interesting to look at ancient Athenian democracy on the basis of whom it included. Because the 70 or so years, 70, 75 years, during which this fragile flower flourished before it was trampled by the Macedonians, later by the Romans, and so on. During those 70, 75 years, we had a very interesting regime in Athens, in which the majority ruled, the majority being the poor, the working poor citizens, men, but nevertheless working poor. Now, all the great and good ancient Athenians, whose names still resonate, hated democracy. Plato was a committed anti-democrat. Aristotle was not so committed, but he was also an anti-democrat. And he actually gave the most interesting definition of democracy. It is a constitution in which the poor and the free, courtesy of being in the majority, control the government. So democracy is a highly politicized, very left-wing concept, if Aristotle is to be believed. A system of governance in which power lies with the poor, who happen to be the majority. This was indeed only possible because of scale being such that it permitted for direct decision-making. And to the extent that democracy was also interwoven with another concept, a much less well-known concept, which to me is or ought to be highly significant. I'll pronounce it in Greek. It's isigoria. The concept of isigoria, which what it means is the right to have your views listened to on their merit, independently of who is speaking the words articulating the view, independently of whether the person who is speaking the words that articulate that view is rich, poor, articulate, rhetorically accomplished, or inarticulate. This is very interesting, so much so that if you were too articulate as in your rhetoric, you got ostracized. Ostracized meant that citizens, during the end of the last final stages of the assembly, they would take an ostraco, which was a shell, a seashell, and write a name of the person that they wanted to expel from the city for being too articulate, too influential, therefore subverting isigoria, stopping those who were less articulate from having their views listened and judged on their merit, not on how beautifully and flowery their speech was. They went to such extremes. And indeed, in the final stage of degenerate Athens, after the end of the Peloponnesian War and the defeat of the tyrants, they went so far as to argue against elections. Elections are deeply undemocratic towards the end of the Athenian democratic period. Why? Because through competition, they create a false dynamic, a competitiveness which usurps the essence of the exchange of ideas, and they replaced elections with random draws, which is where the jury system comes from, or the concept of it. So, anyway, what does our democracy today have to do with this? Nothing. The reason, of course, it's got nothing is because our liberal democracies come from a completely different setup, a different mode of production, as Marx would say. In a sense, they hark back to the Magna Carta, to the notion of rights. Now, the Magna Carta, of course, was the rights of the barons. It wasn't the rights of the slaves, it wasn't the rights of the peasants. It was the rights of the barons to have peasants and slaves, and not to have them poached by the king. So it was a contract between the barons and the king, limiting the power of the king over the barons, so the barons could have unlimited power over the plebs. This is the beginning. It was a social contract between the lords and the monarch. And then with commodification, the first stage of the international trade route building dynamic that led eventually to the Industrial Revolution and to fully fledged commodification in the form of capitalism. You had the merchants that had raw economic power, but no political power. They were the dirty merchants that no aristocrat wanted to be seen dead with them. And they eventually converted their economic power into political power through getting organized and forcing themselves upon the aristocrats and the king. Eventually, you had the proletariat after the enclosures, beginning to organize in the 19th century, and trades unions, organized labor, began to demand its own say And therefore, the modern state emerged as a mechanism for regulating class conflicts. And this is how government proceeded from the narrative of rights to the narrative of liberal democracy. Don't forget that even enlightened liberals like John Stuart Mill were profoundly anti-democratic, profoundly skeptical of the process of parliamentary democracy, for instance. So what we take for granted today, or until recently, what we took for granted, that capitalism and liberal democracy go hand in hand, that they are natural bedfellows. This is a very recent phenomenon. And unless we approach it in the way that Robert Heilbronn, amongst others, recommended, that is, through a study, simultaneous study of economic history, the history of commodification, in a sense, the history of capitalism, the evolution of the conflict between social relations of production and technologies, on the one hand, and, on the other hand, the evolution of our ideas about the world that is being shaped by this process, by this historical evolutionary process, unless we study the past, the present, and potentialities for the future through this prism, we have no chance of using a mathematized approach in order to secure any handle on the reality in which we find ourselves. So the classics of economic theory were all part and parcel of this mindset. Whether you agree or disagree with them, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, all the way to Schumpeter, they tried to stay faithful to this approach. But at the very same time, the same process of commodification that these great economic thinkers were focusing upon produced the imperative for an ideological cover for commodification. And whereas in the Middle Ages, the ideological cover came in the form of religion, in the era of capitalism, it took the form of the illusion of an apolitical, ahistorical, mathematicized economic theory. And exactly the same, in exactly the same way that commodification, the march of, if you want, exchange value against experiential or use value, the march of the commodity that takes over all goods and commodifies them, whether they are things you can eat and touch or intangibles like the genome of certain plants, species, at some point human beings. In exactly the same way that this inexorable march proceeded, in the sphere of social theory, the mathematized, apolitical, ahistorical model proceeded. But the beauty of the human intellect is that the truth will always manifest itself, even in the most abstracted theoretical construct. So, just for one moment, allow me to say a few words about Kenneth Arrow. Just a few moments. Now, Kenneth Arrow, in the mindset of those of us who are of this tradition, let me not explain what this tradition is. I'm at the new school, I don't have to do it. Is somebody who is on the other side, on the dark side of the force. He's somebody who has indulged for years, for decades, this attempt to discover the truth about economic systems in its mathematical structure. And yet, because he has an honest intellect, his impossibility theorem led him to a magnificent discovery that if you want to stay coherent logically and analytically and to be mathematically correct, you have to come to the conclusion that it is impossible to take the preferences, desires, predispositions of individuals and consistently to manufacture out of them a notion, a well-defined understanding of the common will. Now, the beauty of this is that it has two interpretations. One is that if there can be no well-defined notion of the common will, then clearly no state can be justified. Because if there is no well-defined notion of the common will, what on earth is the state serving? Except vested interests. That's the libertarian view, the Hayekian view, if you want. But this is one interpretation. It's an interpretation which is utterly inconsistent with capitalism. Because capitalism without the state is like Christianity without hell. It doesn't work. Capitalism would not have been created without state brutish force, the enclosures that created the working class, the proletariat, that commodified land, that commodified even capital, would not have been possible without the state. And the state could not wither away, to use a Marxian expression, while capitalism needs to be replenished through capital accumulation, because without the state regulating capital accumulation, capital runs out of steam. So what's the other interpretation of Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem? It is that there can be no technical solution to the problem of finding out what we want using as input information, perfect information, of what each one of us desires, which is the best vindication of democracy. Because democracy is not what positive political science teaches, a mechanism from converting private political preferences into what society wants politically. Democracy is dialectic. So Socrates' dialectic, ancient Athenian dialectic, Hegelian dialectic. I'm sitting here, I'm discussing with you, we disagree, and when we leave the room, neither of us are the same persons that entered the room. This conversation has taken a part of you and infused it in my thinking, and has taken a part of me and has infused it in your thinking. And this process is, by definition, dialectical in the sense that it is indeterminate. And therefore, democracy is a system, as my newly acquired wonderful friend Brian Eno said, it's a system for people who are not sure about what they think. And they certainly are not sure about what is good for society. But through arguing, through acting, through praxis, together, they can create that which did not exist, the impossibility theorem. So there is no problem with the mathematics of the mainstream school of economics. The mathematics is beautiful. And if you have a degree of sensitivity in the way you read it, you can acquire wonderful truths out of it. But one truth that you will never acquire, or actually two truths you will never acquire, is firstly the truth about capitalism, because there cannot exist capitalism inside a system of equations. This is where David Laban would disagree with me. And secondly, the truth about democracy, because both are highly indeterminate processes. The only reason why we have this epic struggle in the context of capitalism, between capital and labor, a struggle that can never be resolved as long as capitalism is alive and kicking as a mode of production, is because capital has an ironclad determination and objective and imperative to crush labor, to commodify labor, to cheapen labor, to effectively take over labor. Ideally, the capitalist would like to take your labor away from you and not to have to deal with you. But because the capitalists cannot do that, commodification can never be complete. The fact that commodification can never be complete is what gives value to commodities. And the more successful capitalism is at commodifying human beings, the greater the crisis of capitalism. That is, if you want, a Shakespearean, Sophocles-like, or Euripides-like tragedy where the actors, capital and labor, within this game of capitalism, are condemned never to find equilibrium. It is a profoundly, deeply disequilibrium process. And this epic struggle converts into an epic struggle about democracy. If you think about the American Constitution, if you read the Federalist Papers, and I'm sure you've all read them, the whole point about the American Constitution was how to deprive the demos of democracy. How to make sure, through representative democracy, that the hoi polloi, the plebs, are kept away from the levers of political power, but they lent their legitimacy, or they lent legitimacy to political power through consent, through manufacturing their consent. It is abundantly clear, and it is said so explicitly. Alexander Hamilton, for instance. So democracy was to be used in name in order to be breached in substance. The idea of democracy was essential in the regulation of capitalism. It was essential in ameliorating the crisis of capitalism and the distribution of the burdens of the crisis of capitalism, as long as it never went so far as to render the demos ruling, as long as the demos was always kept out of the democratic process. Now, the experience I had in the Eurogroup is simply the limiting case of this. I just happened, completely accidentally, to land in that position of the finance minister of Greece. And I had the wonderful experience of actually having been told this. For the first time in my life, you will understand this as academics, I didn't have to theorize. They told me. They told me. Let me give you another example, just an anecdote, which I think is my favorite, absolute favorite. I don't know whether you feel the same way as me, but even though most people fall down laughing when I say this, I'm insecure deep down. I feel a certain degree of even intellectual insecurity. I may say things forcefully and believe what I say. For instance, the Greek fiscal consolidation program, I spent years lambasting, writing articles about it, doing econometric analysis about it. But deep down in me, there is still the little boy who would like to think that the adults know what they're doing. That the good people at the IMF, who have a lot more power than I did as a Minister of Finance of a bankrupt state, in the end knew what they were doing. Something deep inside me, even though I never believed it, hoped that that might be the case. So, first time I had a long sequence of negotiations with the good people from the IMF. Tedious, 10 hours with aides, with various committees, and looking at the debt sustainability analysis, and arguing about multipliers and about elasticities. Boring. The good part happened after midnight, over a glass of whiskey in the lobby of a hotel in Brussels, with a top-notch person of that institution, whose name will remain unsaid. You know who it is. I didn't tell you who it is, but you know who it is. Anyway, so after this long day, and after I had killed myself to try to explain to these people why this program is impossible to bear fruit, that the numbers just don't add up. I heard her say, Yanis, of course you're right. This program can't work. I thought, oh no. The adults don't know what they're doing. But then immediately, I was told something else as well. But you must understand, we have invested so much of our political capital in this program that you must accept it in order to remain credible. Okay? Let me now add to this something that another person residing in this country, who actually was really wonderful to me during the difficult time of negotiations, and I really mean this. He contacted me, he called me. I nearly fainted when I heard his name on the phone, that he wanted to help me. I said to him, "Are you sure you want to help me?" He said, "Yes," and he gave me very good reasons, anti-austerity reasons. And I said, "Larry, do you realize that in my previous book, The Global Minotaur," I'm sure you haven't read it. He said, "No, I haven't." I said, "That figures, because in that book, I keep referring to you as the Prince of Darkness." And he said, "At least you're referring to me as a prince." So anyway, when first time we met at another hotel lobby in DC, we were having this long discussion about, again, fiscal targets, tax rates, VAT, multipliers, structural reforms, blah, blah, blah. And I could see that his eyes were glazing over. At some point, he had enough of this conversation, and he wanted to end it and ask me a question. He said, "Before we continue, so that I know to what extent I can help you and what kind of help I should be giving you." And he was very helpful, I mean that, seriously. He understood that what was happening in Greece was simply prolonging secular stagnation, which is his term, for the great slow-burning recession that we have been stuck in since 2008, here in the United States, in Europe, globally. He had a question for me to find out what kind of guy I was and the extent to which I could be helped. He said, "Yanis, you have to make a very important choice, a personal choice. This is a personal, moral choice." I said, "Okay." He said, "You can choose to be an outsider. You can choose to be somebody who speaks truth to power, who tells the truth, who talks to people in the new school." He didn't mean that. He didn't say that, but he could have said that. And that will make you feel good, and you are going to have a pretty good profile, but you will be jettisoned by the political system. Or you can choose to be an insider. If you choose to be an insider, then you'll be given a modicum of power to stay within the system and to make some marginal change within. But the golden rule of the insider is that you never speak out against other insiders outside. So make your choice. Now it's clear what choice I made. Yeah? No, but I think that is important because these are invariant truths about political power in capitalism. The reason, of course, is that the transformation of capitalism from the 19th century authoritarian regimes that afforded rights to property to those who had it and disdained the notion even of elections, to the idea that we all live in democracies and democracy is at one with capitalism. This transformation took place only while, or actually after, power shifted from the political sphere to the economic sphere. It's just like feminization of professions. In exactly the same way that when particular professions like teaching, like nursing, like doctors, like judges in Greece, you may be interested to know, when women grow in numbers within these professions, the remuneration of those professions and the social status of these professions go down. In exactly the same way, for 100 years now, power has been shifting from the political sphere to the economic sphere, which is a democracy-free zone. And only after power left the political sphere was the political sphere democratized. But very soon after that, there was the crisis of capitalism after 1971, the Nixon shock, the passage from the first post-war phase to the second post-war phase, and then suddenly, even that political sphere was set aside with rule-bound codes of decision-making. In the European Union in particular, this has become extremely manifest. If you look at what has happened in Europe in the last 30 years, you will see that we have democratic states with functioning parliaments, with functioning constitutions, but all the important decisions have been moved to the democracy-free zone of the European Union. And I get very annoyed when I hear people saying that there is a democratic deficit in the European Union. There is no democratic deficit. It's like saying that there is an oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen deficit on the moon. There is no oxygen. When in the last Eurogroup meeting I said to my colleagues that the ultimatum they were giving us was such that it was impossible for us either to accept or to reject it. Because they were telling us that if we reject it, it's casus belli with Europe, which is a bit strange because I thought we were part of Europe. How can you be at war with yourself? Anyway, so we didn't have a mandate to declare war against Europe. On the other hand, we didn't have a mandate. I didn't have a mandate to sign a loan agreement whose numbers did not add up. And it was not just my judgment that they didn't add up. It was also the judgment of people like Wolfgang Schäuble, Christine Lagarde, President Draghi of the ECB. In bilateral discussions, they all agreed that these numbers didn't add up, but they wanted me to accept them for my credibility, right? Remember? And at that point, what I said to them was, what we decided, the Prime Minister and our small team, the war cabinet as we called it, we're going to put it to the Greek people. And you can campaign if you want. You can come to Greece and campaign in favor of your proposal. We will campaign against it, and it's up to the Greek people, isn't it? At that point, a number of finance ministers took the floor and looked at me in the eye, incensed, and asked me a very difficult question. You realize that you are putting your people in a difficult situation of having to make a pivotal decision on complicated matters? I said, yes, it's called democracy. It's a very odd system. It's a terrible system. It's an awful system. But as Churchill said, it's the best of all alternatives, right? Do you have a better way of doing it? Of course they had. Every single decision they made in there, firstly, they never consulted anyone about. Secondly, they themselves were not consulted. Their aides reached those decisions behind closed door and then told the ministers. The ministers didn't even understand what they were agreeing to. And thirdly, they never even announced it. It's not just that the populations were presented with a fait accompli. They still don't know what has been decided 6 years ago on their behalf and implemented. So we see that the golden era of the post-war capitalist order, the Bretton Woods system, which was an aberration. It was a system that was created by New Dealers who'd experienced in their bones the trials and tribulations of the Great Depression, and who were determined not to see this happen again, who understood probably not the epic struggle between labor and capital, but at least the epic struggle to recycle surpluses and deficits in complex economies that looked not like general equilibrium models, but closer to something like that Michal Kalecki and John Maynard Keynes would have described. They understood that unless there was political surplus recycling at the global level, it was impossible to maintain fixed exchange rates and therefore to maintain a modicum of stability and an image of civilization for capitalism. It is not, I think, without meaning that Harry Dexter White ensured that in the Bretton Woods Conference, not one banker was allowed to attend. But that system was predicated upon American imperialism as well, the Cold War, and the capacity of the United States to do the surplus recycling, to recycle its own surplus. The moment the United States lost its surplus and slipped into a deficit, the pressing question emerged, so how does the United States superpower maintain its hegemony now that it's no longer in surplus? Every other time in history, a mega power lost its surplus, collapsed. In the United States, we had a magnificent phenomenon of increased hegemony on the foundation of increased deficits. I think that the trick to achieving that was what Paul Volcker said in a discussion with Henry Kissinger in 1970. When Henry Kissinger asked him the question, that was before his before moving to the State Department, when he was still the National Security Advisor. He asked Volcker, how can we maintain our hegemony now that we've lost our surplus? And the answer was, well, if we can't recycle our own surplus, we have to recycle everybody else's surpluses. And that, of course, was achieved through turning the United States of America into a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into American territory the net exports of Germany, of Japan, later of China, and paying for it by also sucking into Wall Street the profits of German, Dutch, Saudi Arabian, Japanese, and later Chinese capital, and therefore closing the loop. But what happens when a tsunami of capital flows into Wall Street every day? Bankers find a way of dividing and multiplying it, of financializing it. But to financialize it, some politicians in DC, have to turn a blind eye to this. And some theorists must provide the legitimation for this. Call it efficient market hypothesis, call it international financial macroeconomics, taught in other universities. I hope you don't teach this rubbish here. And the result is a diminution of the link between even the semblance of liberal democracy with industrial capital, fixed capital formation, the conversion of companies like General Motors into financial instruments that produce some cars on the side. This whole magnificent edifice, of course, collapsed under its own hubris in 2008, and the world remains ever since in limbo. Its crisis, that is a crisis of realization, and the result of the fact that this recycling mechanism is severely broken down, leads China to creating in desperation bubbles in order to buy time for America and Europe to get their act together. But America and Europe are politically ungovernable. Here you have the White House vetoing the Congress and Congress vetoing the White House. In Europe, need I say more? Just put the words European economic governance together and you end up with a joke. And the world we live in is increasingly rudderless, in a constant, slow-burning recession, while at the very, very same time, the increasing concentration in the IT sector is creating the new technologies that will do that which the left has failed to do. Overthrow capitalism. It is really very simple. The moment machines pass the Turing test properly, and you pick up the phone and you do not know whether the person that you are talking to is a human being or a machine. The moment we are going to have 3D printers operating as public utilities, you can send anything, any blueprint to it, and it can print from one pin to a motorcycle or to a car. The moment that this happens, we have not just a process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, but we have a process where economies of scale and the whole logic of corporate capitalism collapses. And at that point, we have a major rupture that the political system, which has been completely depleted of any semblance of democracy, will not be able to regulate. At that point, humanity will be facing a juncture. We either move to a Star Trek-like utopia, where technology becomes our slaves, and we manage to utilize its wealth-creating capacity for the purpose of the common good, which will be democratically determined and not technologically, remember Arrow, or we're going to move towards a matrix-like dystopia where humans, independently of where they are, the owners of these magnificent machines or the masses who are miserable and completely cut off productive society, will all become servants to the machines in exactly the same way that Mary Shelley described and Karl Marx followed in Das Kapital. The choice will depend on democratic politics. The choice is everyone's. Thank you.